you're showing typically how you want to care about them versus how they need to be cared about.
Yeah.
And right there alone can have a game-changing experience between that. And two, there's the, Dr. John Gottman, who's one of the top marital researchers or relationship researchers, talks about the Four Horsemen of the apocalypse. And those are the four character traits that happen in any relationship dynamic, but most specifically are tracked in committed relationships, where if there's criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling at a hyper consistent pattern. We all do it in some way, shape, or form, but when they come in lockstep with each other consistently, will be the main reason why couples end up in an attorney's office.
This is the Workplace Therapist Show, and of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith, and the entire purpose of the show is one singular thing, and that is to help you have better conversations and healthier relationships at work. And our topic today is going to fall squarely in the middle of that. We're going to talk about how do you really prepare yourself to ultimately have some of those really uncomfortable conversations. Maybe it's with a boss, maybe it's with a coworker, maybe it's with your spouse, maybe it's with your mom. Whoever it might be, we're going to talk about that. And to have us guiding through that journey, I've got a wonderful guest and kind of friend and colleague, Jason Wasser. Jason, really good to see you today.
It is so exciting to be back seeing you, even though from across the screen versus in person. We're going to work on that.
I know. One day we're going to get to see each other in person. Yep. But last time we got to collaborate like this, I got the pleasure of being on your show. So
it was really exciting.
Really,
I was really glad to have you.
I was so thrilled to be on it, and so glad to be able to have you on our show to kind of help and guide all of our listeners. So just to orient folks to who you are, you've got lots of really, really cool titles. So I want to make sure I don't mess these up. You're a licensed marriage and family therapist. You're a certified entrepreneur coach, and you're a host of You Winning Life podcast.
Yes. And since we last talked, I'm actually creating a new podcast with a friend of mine who's a matchmaker called Have We Got a Match for You? And it's all about getting from, the whole navigation of figuring out relationships and dating, and if people, the whole gamut of lifestyle dynamics going from, individualhood to serious and hopefully healthy relationships. So it's been a busy couple of weeks since we last.
That sounds like really fun and exciting. What got you curious about doing that? What was the spark?
So the pandemic got this going. So, thankfully, technology has really taken over in a healthy, good way, right? As opposed to everybody complaining about it, how it's been a detriment to our society. But people are looking for connections, and in a lot of different communities, people are just offering stuff and creating community. I've been doing 2 to 3 classes a week for young professionals. And I was invited to a speed dating event by this group in New York. And halfway through the event, I'm looking at the population. I'm like, this is so not for me. But being a good therapist and business marketer I reached out to the host and said, thank you for having me. The group isn't for me. However, let me offer some resources. And then I started teaching classes for them. And then we came up with this idea. And so now it's in pre-production. And so far, anything we've put out as far as little bits and pieces, getting some really good traction in the singles community. So trying to solve one little problem at a time, right? The more niche you get, the better it is, and the more fun we can have with it.
One relationship problem at a time.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, okay. So maybe before we jump all the way into our topic today,
sure.
Elaborate a little bit more on all the hats you do wear. What are the things that you do kind of as you're walking through the world to kind of help folks?
Yeah. So the reverse engineering is I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, but I've always been passionate about mind-body integrative wellness. And for years, as I was working in my therapy practice, I always saw myself only as that therapist and that healer and never as a business person. So I was really good at doing the therapy part, but really crappy at the business side of things, the entrepreneurship side of things. And I had a friend of mine for a few years trying to convince me to join him at a workshop in Dallas. After a long time, I finally agreed. And by the end of the first day, I was shaking out of excitement because my realization was, oh my God, I am an entrepreneur. I didn't realize that I can put those two things together as far as being a helper, being an uplifter, being a supporter as we do in our field.
Chocolate and peanut butter. Chocolate and peanut butter.
Exactly. And unfortunately, right, a lot of the clinical programs don't teach that, right? It's if you make money, you're doing something wrong, because how can you not help more money? Who can't afford you?
Right.
And unfortunately, right, that's part of the mentality in a lot of fields. It wasn't necessarily in mine, but there was still that trickle down effect from the culture of the community, of mental health and therapy and being accessible to all. And it was when I started to realize like core values, realizing what your purpose is, what your mission is, who you're, right, your niche, as you and I have talked about, like getting to very specifically solving a problem in a very specific community in a specific way, allow me to start using this methodology from the entrepreneurship world and bringing it back into my practice. So that evolved into me going from, it's eclectic because it's, counseling and therapy, it's mind body medicine, it's sports psychology, it's addictions, right? But it all goes back to stress, overwhelm, and figuring out what your mission and purpose is. Some of them are tools and some of them are approaches. Yeah. And I think trying to weave all those together has been my bread and butter. And I really love combining that mind body, where it shows up at work, at family, at home, business, self-sabotage, whatever it may be. And how do you put out how do I want to say it? How do you put out your best version of yourself?
Yeah.
Without having anything limiting you, whether you're aware of it or not.
Yeah. And what I love about that is not only are you trying to treat kind of the whole person, but you're also treating people in all walks of life.
Right.
And I think, I'm biased in this way, but I think kind of thinking as a therapist, thinking through the lens of business, what it allows us to do is actually, ironically enough, help more people, because we can find ways to get folks over here that can pay us to then ultimately give it away over here and not have to worry about not having food on our table.
Absolutely. So and one of the things I've realized that I found mind blowing, and when I share this to other entrepreneurs, it kind of like is a really insightful aha, is that I find that the methodology or the field of entrepreneurship, when done well, and I'm not talking about the rise and grinders and I'm gonna take a course to teach you how to sell a course type of thing. But like true, right? The entrepreneurship where there's a substance to it, is that it's one of the truest and healthiest way to self-actualization.
Ah, beautiful.
And when I looked at that lens of, I can take all these themes from entrepreneurship models, conscious capitalism, right, servant leadership, all of those wonderful things that are out there, and then bring it back into, how does it apply to a family? How does this apply to a relationship? How does it apply to any aspect, parenting, whatever it may be? It just enriches the conversation on such a deep level.
Yeah, for not only that person, but also for you.
Right.
It's helping you create a life that fits you like a glove more than like a mitten.
And I put that out there, right? It's like, this is what I'm going to share. If this is not what you're looking for, then I'm not the right therapist. I'm happy to refer you somewhere else. So I think that's a big part of, right, when you start owning those all parts of yourself, right, whether it's from your perspective of what you're doing, whether it's my perspective, right, or the people that are listening to this episode, is how do you integrate all the parts that seem fragmented in your own mind to become more authentic and more purposeful?
Yeah, beautiful. All right, okay. All right, I'm super excited. Let's take this train out of the station. All right, okay, so what I know to be true right now is every single person listening and watching this right now has at least one conversation they should be having that they're not. I mean, you and I both know this is true. I mean, this is just to be human is to have a conversation that you're not having. So can you help us through that? What are some of the maybe you can go any direction you like, but maybe a good starting place is, what are some of the emotional or physical costs when we don't have these conversations? Maybe that's a good starting place, and then we can start to move into how do we push through this and actually do it.
So there's a great quote that's also a book called "Feelings Buried Alive Never Die."
Oh, nice.
Okay, so what that means is, on my understanding,
just so I have this right, feelings.
Yes.
Feelings buried alive never die.
Yeah.
Wow. That sounds super creepy.
Right?
It does.
And not only does it sound super creepy, it also sounds super hippy dippy and super hokey on some levels, right? But when you look at the biochemistry about how we process and resolve emotions, the first, major challenge of reorienting people's approach to this is that emotions are not psychological, they're physiological. That they're biochemical responses that are then becoming an external expression or an internal expression, right? But it starts with us going through a biochemical response, and our body is trying to either assimilate it or it's not assimilating it. And when it doesn't, it becomes anxiety, depression, body pain, chronic injury, disease, right? That's if you split up the word disease, it's dis-ease, right? You're not at ease. So that conversation is so interesting because it could be a conversation you might even have to have with yourself.
Oh, wow.
And I had a conversation with one of my clients who I adore yesterday, and who's been chronically unwell, who's just a powerhouse of a human being and just has constant, has not been well, constant sicknesses. And we started getting into theology and philosophy about it. And again, it's not my agenda. It's what's their beliefs. And, I want to help them navigate their beliefs. If there's anything that they're holding on to that might be, subconsciously or unconsciously initiating or enhancing that trauma.
Yeah.
And they said, one of the things they said is like, I know that I take extra special care to not talk about other people. And I said, that's really interesting. What's it like for you to not also talk about the body parts or the parts of you that isn't working? Do you also not do that versus going to ask for help or saying, my stomach hurts today, and putting it in that same category of, I don't want to talk bad about anything.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think people have a fear of who are they going to hurt? Number one, because a lot of people have the assumption that they're responsible for everybody else's emotions and feelings. So I challenge everybody to fire themselves from that assumption. And number two, that they're going to have some negative repercussion because of it.
Yeah.
Valid or invalid.
So those 2 points are so powerful, I think it's worth repeating them. So the first one is getting rid of this idea that I'm responsible for other people's emotions, responsible for how other people feel. Right? Which is this, really, when you think about that, it's almost a narcissistic view that you have such control over everyone else. You can kind of puppet master their emotional state. And I know it comes from a good place, but it's definitely not healthy in that way. And then the other one that you mentioned was that if I do this, as a mentor of mine would say, he said, I promise when you have these conversations, you're not going to die. Right? Like somehow I'm going to die, or this person's going to die, or something horrible is going to happen if I have this conversation, right? It's just a conversation. Exactly. But this idea that, I've got control of other people's emotions and something horrible is going to happen if we have this conversation. Yeah.
Well, do you know who's the best example of someone who does the opposite of it?
Who?
The gentleman on your wall behind you.
Oh, are you talking about Dwight Schrute?
Regional manager, Dwight
Yes.
Schrute. He would always ask for what he wanted. He would always go out of the way. And then sometimes it made him look like he was very needy or very trying to manipulate the situation. But he was always very clear with his intentionality. I will one day become regional manager of this.
Right.
So there was not, what is everybody going to think about me? I know this in my bones. I know this is what I'm born to do. I know this is what I need to do. Right now, the miss was that he didn't leverage everybody around him to help support him until the end, right? But I think that's a good example of like asking for what you want, asking for what you need is something that people are very difficult, have difficulty with, whether it's at a restaurant, or not. And it's funny enough, I'll share a very quick story about this. I have a friend of mine who happens to be American, moved to Israel many years ago, and he was coming back to run a program here for a couple of years. And the week before that, he was in Jerusalem, and there was a Sbarro's Pizza in Jerusalem. And I don't know if you remember, around 2001, there was the bombing in Sbarro's. He was there inside the pizzeria during that time. And what saved his life is that he said, I typically don't ask if anything comes back to my table cold or missing something. I don't want to bother anybody. But that day he decided, because the pizza was cold, to send it back. And then they said to him, don't worry about it. We'll go, we'll bring it out to you. And he's like, you know what? I'm not going to sit in the front. I'm going to go into the upstairs area. It's a little bit more quiet. And the fact that he asked for the pizza to be sent back saved his life. He asked for what he wanted.
Wow.
For the first time in how long he can remember.
That's
that's what I want to impress into people, that like it is a life and death scenario sometimes, to put it out there, to have these conversations with yourself and with others.
Okay. So, we're at break, and I really don't want to go to break right now. We're going to, but I'm going to tease this when we come back from break. Here's what I want you to help us with. How do we get more comfortable not only being able to ask for what we want and need, but being able to know what we want and need? Because I think those are two different things.
Yeah.
Sometimes we bury that down so deep we can't even articulate what we want and need. It just manifests in other ways. It's almost like almost like an itchiness.
So can I leave it before we go to the break? Can I leave a 2-word teaser?
Yes, of course.
Core values.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask you about that right after the break.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for listening to the show. In case you haven't heard, Brandon's got a new book out. He's going to tell you all about it.
Thanks, Emily. So the book is The Hot Sauce Principle, How to Live and Lead in a World Where Everything is Urgent All the Time. And if you're like me, and like most of us, everything does feel urgent all the time. It's like hot sauce is being poured on everything, whether it's our work life, our family life, coming from our clients, coming from our boss. And so the book is a practical guide on how do we manage urgency. Not only how do we set proper boundaries, but how do we properly create urgency when we need to. So I wrote the book for you. I can't wait for you to get a copy.
Thanks, Brandon. Don't forget to check out The Hot Sauce Principle, available now on Amazon.com. Back to the show.
Okay, welcome back from break. Of course, this is the Workplace Therapist Show, and I'm your host, Brandon Smith. And so Jason Wasser was guiding us through how do we have these more difficult conversations. And Jason, right before the break, you and I both put out some teasers. I said, help us to kind of identify what are those needs and wants so we can start to then articulate that out to the world. And then you said 2 words, core values.
Yes.
So let's go back to those 2 words. Tell us what you mean by those.
So everything can be put down to simplicity if you know that which you believe in and that which you're making day-to-day decisions on. And the things that are in your life that are wanted and are unwanted are either because you are aware of your core values and you're making decisions on it, or you're not. And that's, when people talk about have a conscious living or a proactive living or an aware living or a mindful living, that can be one of the tools that we can add to our life to make it way easier and way more profound and way more powerful. So the simplistic way that I put it is I can't help you get to your goal until I know what you're making those decisions based on. So we can work on something for weeks and months, but it may not be true to your integrity of who you want to be and where you want to be if we don't have these, this set of like 4 to 6, 7, 8 core key values in that category of your life. So I start with people in the generic, what are your personal core values? In other words, like, on your tombstone, what would you want to do? And if we reverse engineer any personal decisions in your life, what would be the yes or no decision-making filter? That's like the lenses of your glasses, right? So you can say, does this meet this criteria? Yes, I'll do it. It doesn't meet this criteria. No, I won't. And then start doing that with different aspects of your life, relationships, jobs, parenting stuff, community stuff, financial stuff, whatever it may be, food. I choose my coffee of where I buy my coffee from based on a set of core values: organic, fair trade, 1%, carbon offset. It donates to women who are being abused in third world countries, right? I'm like, tick, 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 tick. You're going to get an extra couple dollars out of me because you meet my core, right? So I try to do as much as possible with that because then I know, I feel good about it. 2, I feel consistent. And 3, I'm not going to regret. I'll regret way less than we typically do when we're not being proactive like that.
Okay. All right. Beautiful. I'm going to now leap us forward a little bit.
Yes.
And I'm going to, so I think you can help us build this bridge. Now I'm going to throw us into the situation where we've got a coworker that we don't get along with. We don't like how she's operating or how he's operating, and they're driving us crazy. We're not maybe even sure why we don't like them, but there's just something about them, and we want to stop this. So what's kind of some steps we can take to get better or ready to have that conversation?
Sure. So I think you and I know this from our clinical training is the first thing is the understanding that they're a mirror to something going on in us.
Beautiful.
And the idea is it may be a micro to a macro or a macro to a micro. So you have to search around for it. It may not be linear that they're acting this way. And if I can define how they're acting, that bothers me. It's because I'm doing that in some way. It may be a thematic thing about that, right? They could be very, very abrupt and very curt. And you might find ways in your life that you're just not, right. You're being shortchanged, or you're shortchanging others with your time, effort, and energy. And it may be showing up in a verbal way with that person, but you're doing it with your time, effort, and energy. So one, I would ask people to kind of look at that. It's not what the problem is what is your belief about the problem? That is the first thing that I would challenge them to do. Yep. So I think if that's tool 1, step 1 to this process. And number 2 is that it's like the four agreements. One of the big four agreements is like, it's not about you. Don't take it personal.
Yeah.
And that's where we're going back to like that level of narcissism. Like, well, they're only doing this to me. Well, they're, why do we have to get stuck in that? Because that's the first, the next line of like, it hurts me. Why isn't anybody else doing anything about it? So we start becoming victimized in that story. And I would then ask, what's the benefit to being a victim? How does being a victim in this specific circumstance serve you? Right? This is even this, because remember, none of this has anything to do with the other person. They're just, because someone else might be in the same scenario and it won't bother them.
Very
how that
fair.
person acts.
Yeah.
Right? So this is all about us more than it is about them. But once we start having that level of like, instead of being reactionary and just jumping in on it and like snapping at them and like going to HR and whatever it may be, is first understanding these things. And this is going to take some work. This is why we're having these conversations, and why you have these conversations on your podcast. But it is sometimes not solving the problem with them is really about solving the problem with yourself. And then going in there, yes, they may truly be an a-hole. They may truly be not a good person. They may be toxic. They may be really sabotaging everything. You can navigate it from a different perspective of, just like you said, let's proactively do it. Hey, can we find a time? There seems to be some energy that's going on, some vibe between the two of us that's going on. It could be just me. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. I would love to solve this. Do you have time that we can go grab a cup of coffee? Do we have time that we can sit down? Do we have time that because here's what and find a point about them that you can honor.
Oh, nice.
I see this in you. I notice this about you. And and this is where some people really have to struggle. Why would I have to do that? They're making my life hell. Find one thing that you admire about them. I was just watching John McCain's concession speech.
Oh yeah, that was a great
President
speech.
Obama, right? And of course, he's laughing in heaven right now with all the votes going on. This is what happens when you insult me, right? And but talking about being like, these are the things that we agree on. These are the things that I'm going to do to help support the mission of our country. We may not agree on everything, but here are the things that I positively see and that I admire about that person. So I think like that's such a perfect, especially in our time of history right now with what's going on. And as we're sitting here on day 42 of election counting, day 3, but feels like 42, right? That's the focus, that you can solve a problem by always looking at the positive and trying to find it, even if you're like, there's nothing there. And then having the conversation from that place.
So what I love about what you just said is something I want to attend to that you didn't say. That often people's first move is to say, you are doing this to me. You know what you're doing, and you're doing that because you're trying to whatever to me. Yeah. And you didn't say any of that. And I think it's really important to attend to that. You said, I want to work on this with you. Mm-hmm. I have had this experience with you. I admire these things about you. It's much more of a olive branch bridge building approach, because you're really inviting that person to have an adult conversation with you and an adult relationship with you.
And it's also about personal accountability.
Yeah.
That, right? Like I said before, like you can't be, if you start going to the opposite direction of the you, like you were just saying, then you go right into victimhood, and you can't be empowered and be a victim at the same time. It's impossible. You can't carry both.
Oh, that's another mic drop moment right there. Can't be empowered and a victim at the same time. Wow. Okay. So let's do a different scenario. Sure. We'll just throw it out there. I'll let you kind of riff in any kind of direction that you can think of. How about with couples? Is it different? Is the approach different, or is it the same?
Same. I'm going to add a different complexity, and then we can also bring it back into the previous scenario. But number one, how does someone need to be validated, right? Going into the 5 love languages and all of that stuff. And the 5 love languages, which we don't have to break down. People can just Google, go to the website 5lovelanguages.com and learn that. But that applies in every single relationship that you're in, whether it's parenting or friends or business, is to learn what they need in order to feel validated and appreciated and showing that you're caring about. So that's one of the bridges, first of all, that I find when couples are fighting and they aren't aware of that. Like, well, you're showing typically how you want to care about them versus how they need to be cared about.
Yeah.
And right there alone can have a game-changing experience between that. And 2, there's the Dr. John Gottman, who's one of the top marital researchers or relationship researchers, talks about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And those are the four character traits that happen in any relationship dynamic, but most specifically are tracked in committed relationships, where if there's criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling at a hyper consistent pattern, we all do it in some way, shape, or form, but when they come in lockstep with each other consistently, will be the main reason why couples end up in an attorney's office. So the criticisms are the you always. I hate it when you, why do you always, you're just like your mother, right? One of those type of things, right? That you're basically finding a critical flaw that's how they were born and there's nothing they can do to erase it or fix it. Is criticism. Contempt is the eye rolling, the right, or the go F yourselves, or right, the I hate you, right? The people that so it can be both verbal and nonverbal. The defensiveness is the warding off a perceived attack in one of those two things. Me, what about when you? Which we're seeing tons of right now. The political environment is rife with the defensiveness.
Oh, yeah.
It's not right when someone talks about another person on the other side, it's the immediate lobbing the grenade back versus saying, you know what, you might be right about that, right? But then they just go, well, what about when that happened with your guy, right? That's just defensiveness in that pattern, right? It's a criticism defense mechanism. But then you have the last one, which is huge, is stonewalling. Stonewalling is the just shut down. I'm not going to respond. You might be talking to me, but I'm just going to, it's as if I'm not even hearing you or even walking out of the room. So those are the four horsemen. Those four things determine the success and health of any communication pattern in a relationship.
So what's interesting about that, if we take that couples dynamic versus kind of a workplace coworker dynamic, we probably all experience some version of that at work. But it's not the same kind of relationship. We're not as emotionally invested, and we can walk away from it. We can just say, well, I'm just not going to deal with Susan. Like, I'm not going to deal with Barry. Like, I can just I can create space.
But in those scenarios, there might be a different type of life and death experience, which is that person can get me fired and therefore not be able to take care of my family, or that person is competition for me advancing or moving forward in this company.
Yeah.
So there is that nuance of it's a different relationship.
Yeah.
Right. But but we still have to acknowledge power differentials in any relationship.
It reminds me, I had a friend of mine years ago, and he came to a class I was teaching, and he was on the panel, and he had been a partner in a big consulting firm, and he was one of the more senior partners. And he said I liked everybody, got along with everybody except this one other guy, this one other partner. I didn't get along with him. He didn't get along with me, and I didn't care. And he said, so one day we were doing this big offsite, all the partners with the managing director, managing partner, doing some planning, strategic planning, or some kind of hotel, and then we broke for lunch. And in the lunch buffet line, the managing partner was standing next to my nemesis in line, and just turned to him while they're getting chicken and said, hey, what do you think about, and mentions my friend. And the nemesis turned to him and told him exactly what he thought about him. And then my friend said within about 3 weeks, his responsibilities got changed. And within about 6 months, he was exited from the firm. Yeah. So he said, you can't walk through life with that kind of attitude. You've got to find a way to even build some of those bridges, because you never know when someone's going to be standing next to somebody in line getting chicken and your name comes up.
Right. It's poison, right? And usually until we're asked, we're carrying that inside of ourselves, only poisoning ourselves. And then once we release it in a non-useful way, it then poisons other people in their experiences.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where that whole idea of like slander and mindful conversation and mindful talk about and a lot of different traditions and spiritual traditions have different, cultures and rules around that and customs and philosophies around that. Which is probably where our law system around slander and those type of speech in the legal precedents have gotten created. But I think whatever we're carrying inside of us, the longer we're carrying it, the longer it's marinating and the longer it's fermenting. And eventually we'll become a pressure cooker and will show up. And if it's not going to be dealt with that person, it's going to show up in some other relationship that resembles or hints some type of attributes around that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Everybody's a metaphor. So everybody's a metaphor about something to somebody else. And it will manifest somewhere.
Yeah. So I said, look, our timer is ticking. Although you've inspired me to go over time a little bit today, so we're gonna keep going a little bit. I want to pivot a little bit. I loved you talking about the Four Horsemen, and I mean that's definitely a killer in personal relationships, and definitely can be an issue in professional relationships. What can we do if we're noticing we're exhibiting any of those? How can we either stop ourselves, or what are healthy practices we can put in place that might keep those horsemen at bay?
Yeah. So the first thing I say is don't change anything until you notice how often and how consistent and where it's showing up, because you can't move a Mack truck going in the opposite direction on a dime.
So it's like you learn, this shows up when the topic of mother-in-law comes up. And then all of a sudden, the horsemen are here.
Exactly. Which means that we're all going to be busy solving that problem for the next number of weeks, right? Since, those of us who have those who have mother-in-laws. It's funny, Dr. Joe Dispenza in his TED Talk, like that's the one he picks. Like, and this is why you're always triggered when your mother-in-law comes. Like, it's always I feel bad for the mother-in-laws. They always get a bum rap. So yeah, I think the first step is to be aware. But in order to be aware, you have to become an informed consumer. So I think that we no longer have the excuse to be, well, I'm not that type of person, to become that type of person. That's just not who I am, right? We have to let go of that excuse of anybody. And I hear it, right? We hear it typically more from males than from females, that type of languaging. But it's about like, okay, what self-growth, what work am I willing to do? But what awareness am I willing to take first? What am I willing to learn about this? These patterns, these topics, these communication, right? Everybody who comes in, couples wise, 99% of them say we're coming in for communication issues. No, you communicate. You just have different beliefs and meanings about what you're saying to each other. So it's not a communication issue. It's really a linguistics and meta message issue. But everybody's stuck in communication. I would get really clear about not what the issue is, but what is it, again, like I said before, what is your belief about that issue? And what's the worst part about that happening to you? Because the problem is never the problem. It's your belief about the problem and the effect that the problem has on you. That's really the issue. And if we can get clear on that, right? Step one is identifying what it is. This thing, whatever that's going on, I don't like it. I'm being triggered. Step two, okay, what does that issue mean to me? What does it say about someone who does that, or that someone treats me that way? Three, what's the worst part about me having to get the brunt of that or that affecting me? From there, you can do some really cool strategic work.
Yeah. And what I notice about that is it's all about you, what you can change, what you see in you, how you're approaching things, how you're viewing things.
Exactly. One of my favorite quotes from Esther Hicks from the Law of Attraction World is that you can't stand on your head in enough different ways to get anybody else to see or feel about you any differently than they already do.
Interesting.
And any other effort to do that is futile.
Yeah. So when we do get to a place where we've recognized those things about ourselves, we've changed what we can change, and we're looking now to find a way to bridge the gap between ourselves and that other person. Any tips you have for us on how we start to navigate that bridge building process?
My guess would be for many people, they're going to find that the problem actually goes away.
When they do that work with
when
themselves.
They do that first. Yeah. When they do that work for themselves, because really all work is self-work, right? All hypnosis is self-hypnosis, all healing is self-healing. But it really is, again, it's all about our story, about, how we're being slighted, how we're being harmed, how we're being disadvantaged, how we're being victimized, right? It's all, we still have to look at that. And number two, like, again, if you can go back to the empowerment model of like, don't take the assumption that you know the reason why they're treating you or acting the way that they are, which again, it goes back to the book, The Four Agreements, right? Don't make assumptions. You have no clue whether they had a bad day, didn't have a bad day, previous trigger, traumas, whatever. But our first thought is, well, they're doing this to me. So how do we get back to that more holistic, whole person perspective of, stand in their shoes, right? As that old adage, right? Spend a day in their shoes type of thing. But also like assume the assumption I would say would be safe to do, it would be healthy to do, is assume that they maybe also want to solve the problem with you too.
Okay.
And work from there.
Yeah. And then maybe
versus that they're happy to hold on to it.
And maybe state that.
Yeah.
It's a healthy thing to state.
Right. When you put it out there, you're leading with it, right? Like, hey, like I know there's something going down with us. My assumption is that I know this doesn't feel good for me. I'm wondering, does it also not feel good for you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm smirking and smiling as you're talking because I'm thinking about how many times I have clients that come to me and say, I've got to have this difficult conversation. I don't know how to have this difficult conversation with my boss. I don't have to have this difficult conversation with my direct report or my peer or whatever happens to be. And as they talk it out, I stop and pause. And I say, that's what you just said to me. Say exactly that to that person. It was so honest and transparent and genuine and with the spirit of trying to improve this and a vulnerability. Say it just like that.
Yeah.
And then of course they always say back to me, how did I say that? But I think that's a good thing.
Always record the sessions. So yeah, that's right. That's a little hack for that. But yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. Or sometimes I'll offer like a quick, have you tried something like this? And I'll kind of sketch something out like verbally. And they're like, oh wow, can you repeat that again so I can write it down? I'm like, oh crap, I already forgot what I said. Yeah. Right. So because it was so salient in the moment, we're ready to move. Why didn't you get that? But yeah, I think that a lot of times simplicity wins. Simplicity wins when you get out of because when you're trying to solve a problem, you're already in reaction, right? Because that's reptilian brain. It's survival instinct.
Yeah.
Like I said before, the life or death if this doesn't get solved. So we have to realize that we're in reptilian brain survival, and one of us can only win here versus getting back into our rational brain, our neocortex, and saying, both of us can uplift each other and both of us can win.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big, from the biochemistry, neuroscience side.
Oh boy, Jason, I could have you on for hours. In fact, I'm going to have you back on. So, awesome. But I want to honor your times. And I always ask this question of all my guests, and this essentially would be an opportunity to summarize any one major point, because this really sums up the entire conversation we had. But do you have any life hack for us on how we can have better conversations and build better relationships, either at work or at home?
Yeah. So I once heard from a new friend that we shouldn't try to solve everything like there's hot sauce on it.
Nice. I was wondering who the new friend was.
And right, patience goes a long way. Simplicity goes a long way. Not everything is on fire. And again, I can't get more simple than right. And just what is the simplest? Sometimes the simplest response, the simplest way is the best way.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Just keep it simple.
Yeah,
honest, authentic, vulnerable. All those good things.
And when in doubt, refer back to the Four Agreements. It's so crazy. Like that book. Like I always tell my clients, because I'm sure you and I probably have comparable libraries, and as far as what we're the breadth and width of what we're reading and looking into. But I'm like, listen, if you're going to spend $12 on anything, go get this book, The Four Agreements, right? It's like there's 4 simple things, right? Be impeccable with your word. Don't talk crap about yourself. Don't talk crap about anybody else, right? Don't take things personally. Nothing. You have no clue why right? It's not about you. Don't make assumptions, and you're going to screw up. Try over again. That's it. Wash and repeat.
Nice. It's good kind of life mantra, really.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah, you're going to screw up. Wash and repeat. Try over again.
So, Jason, you're an absolute gift. If people want to learn more about you, follow you, connect with you, listen to you, where can they go?
First of all, they should definitely come to the podcast so they can hear our episode that we had.
That's great.
So that was released a little bit, right? So that's You Winning Life on all major podcast platforms. Instagram, you can find all the resources. It's Jason Wasser, LMFT, which stands for Licensed Marriage and Family Therapist. And if you're not an Instagram person or a social media person, The Family Room, SFL, which is South Florida, abbreviated.com.
Nice. Beautiful. Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on the show. Definitely going to have you come back again.
Love it.
And thank you all for listening and watching the show today. If you haven't rated or reviewed the show, please do. I mean, what's holding you back? That's how people find out about the good work we're doing and grows our tribe. And if you want additional resources, you can go to my site, theworkplacetherapist.com, for blogs, past podcasts, articles. And if you haven't bought a copy of my new book, The Hot Sauce Principle, How to Live and Lead in a World Where Everything is Urgent All the Time, you should. It would be a great thing for you to have and make your life better and healthier. And you can get that on Amazon, or you can even buy it off of my site. And so until our next show, have a great week and an awesome life.